Well, thank you very much, Stephen, and thank you, all of you, for coming out here. It is quite a privilege for me to be sitting here with such a fine panel in a city that so richly exemplifies our subject this evening. The conversation, as Stephen pointed out, is about the Middle East's role in the new Silk Road. And it's quite a provocative thought. The notion here is that the great medieval trade route from Asia across the Middle East and on to Europe and North Africa is being revived in a new form. Historical analogies, I would say, are always iffy, and this one in particular raises a lot of food for thought. Is this new route intended for a rising Asia and Middle East to bypass the West, or is it truly a road east to west along which not only goods and investments but also ideas and values can move? What is the human and social component of this route? Is it going to be forever based on an exchange of oil for consumer goods, or is there a greater future in it? So let's get right into the discussion. I will start by asking each of the panelists to make a statement. If any of you have a question, please jump right in, raise your hand, but afterwards wait until you've been given a microphone, because this is being live streamed, and that's the only way the millions out there who are watching can hear. If you would identify yourself, that would also help. I think it's quite exciting to have this board up there. This is, in a way, the second stage of the device revolution. Before, everybody sat with them on their laps. Now they can have them on their laps and watch what they're writing on a big board. So feel free to share your questions either that way or with a raised hand. I will start with Tom Friedman. My question to him is, when is he finally going to get a fourth Pulitzer, which he so richly deserves?
I'm on the board now, Serge. I can't get any more.
That's what explains it. Tom has a very provocative column in today's New York Times about his visits he's currently touring the Middle East, and he speaks of American aid to Egypt and to Lebanon and compares them. Points out that the aid to Egypt was military, the aid to Lebanon was educational, and he makes a very surprising conclusion about which is wiser and more efficient. So Tom, let me ask you to start us off.
Well, thanks, Serge. It's great to be here in Dubai and for the Herald Tribune and the New York Times and with this great panel. I think I'll just toss out several things that are on my mind, and just to maybe get the juices flowing. I have been in Beirut for a week, and Amman, and now here. And so when I think about the broad trends that are affecting the region, and whether this end of the Silk Road, as you talked, Serge, I would say, if we start at 30,000 feet, what we're seeing is the end of a 100-year order that really dominated this region. A Sunni-dominated Iraq post-Britain, a Alawite-dominated Syria, sort of post-war, a Maronite-dominated Lebanon, a military-dominated Egypt. We're seeing the collapse of a great order. And to me, the question is, how will the transition be managed? And I would say there are two basic options. You need either a midwife or a Mandela. When order collapses like this, either you need a external midwife. That was the role the United States played in Iraq. First, we collapsed the existing order, including the state and the army. And then we served, with all the travails and problems you all know, as the midwife to a new order, albeit imperfect, but one that I would argue has a 1 in 10, 2 in 10 chance of producing, in the long run, a decent outcome. We can talk about that later. What concerns me about Syria is I see neither a Mandela nor a midwife, but I see the potential there for complete state collapse. And Certainly, I've always believed that Egypt implodes, Lebanon implodes, Yemen implodes, Tunisia implodes, Libya implodes, Syria explodes. And that's why I believe the events in Syria are actually the most important of the whole Arab Spring, because they have the potential to blow up the entire Eastern Mediterranean. I think it's more important even than Egypt, how Syria goes. And so the big question for me really is who will be the midwife in Egypt? The army is trying to do it, but the army is an interested party. And so its ability to act as that midwife is I think, constrained. That's, I think, the first broad trend. The second broad trend I would point to is what's underlying this Arab awakening. And of course, there are many forces at play here. Like any volcanic eruption this large, it draws energy from multiple sources. But I had the pleasure and honor of being in Tahrir Square when this happened and seeing it firsthand. And when I got home, people said to me, well, what did you see? And I told people, watching Tahrir Square was the most apolitical political event I've ever covered. At its root, it was actually deeply apolitical. It was, in my view, a raw, inchoate eruption from Arab youth living in a flat world, actually, and being able to look out and see how everybody else was living in India, China, Brazil, etc., and understood and understanding that they were deeply behind. And that left them both frustrated and humiliated. And what emerged, I think, in Egypt at its root was a deep, again, inchoate, raw, but enormously powerful explosion of youth aspiration for the openness, freedom, educational tools, decent governance, and jobs to enable them to realize their full potential. I think this world, this part of the world, was full, brimming full and overfull of young people who feel just as smart, just as capable of people all over the world, but deeply frustrated that they could not realize their full potential. And what that explosion did was not blow the lid off Egypt, it blew the lid open. Didn't blow it off, blew it open. The lid is still there in the form of the Egyptian government and army, but they blew it open. And in that opening came the most organized political force, which happened to be the Muslim Brotherhood. But I would tell you that if that Muslim Brotherhood does not respond to the initial core reasons for this eruption, it will run into enormous problems. And I would argue that this is going to be a real challenge for the Muslim Brotherhood, because the story of Iran today is political Islam in power with oil. The story of Saudi Arabia today is political Islam in power with oil. The story of Egypt is going to be political Islam in power without oil. Without oil to buy off all the contradictions. That, my friends, is going to be pay-per-view, okay? That is going to be a real drama and encounter with modernity. And I would just say, then one last thing, which gets us to the Silk Road and the global context within which this is all happening. You know, I often say to myself, what would we be talking about if 9/11 hadn't happened, if the subprime crisis hadn't happened, if the Arab Awakening hadn't happened? What would be the big global trend we would be talking about? I think we'd be talking about the most important thing going on in the world today, the thing that's shaping and affecting more other things. And that is, in my view, the merger of globalization and the IT revolution. We are having the IT revolution has vaulted forward Twitter, Facebook, iPhones, web-enabled, browser-enabled cell phones at breakneck speed over the last 5 years, which is driving more globalization, and this more globalization is opening more countries to the IT revolution. This merger is actually the biggest thing happening in the world today, and it is changing everything. In my own language, we've gone from flat world 1.0 to flat world 2.0. We've gone from a connected world to a hyper-connected world, and I'll talk about this in more detail in my talk tonight. But I will just say this, which is the underlying implication of this. When you go from a connected to a hyper-connected world, the single most important fact that leads to, what it does, is if the whole world were a single classroom, the whole global curve just rose. Because I, as an employer in Dubai or New York or Silicon Valley or London or Europe, I now have access in a hyper-connected world to so much more powerful and so much cheaper and so much more available cheap labor, cheap software, cheap automation, cheap robotics, and cheap genius than ever before. The whole global curve has risen. And hence, for me, the single most important fact of our age is that average is over. Average is officially over. And the pressure this is putting labor under in the developed world, let alone in the developing world, let alone in a world that's been deeply behind, is going to be enormously important. We can talk about what the impact of that is and what the response should be later. So just to get the ball rolling.
Thank you very much, Tom. That raising in particular the questions of the Arab Spring puts onto the table one of the major questions hanging over this entire discussion. Maybe I'll turn to you now, Masood. When we talk of this new Silk Road, we tend immediately to think of the oil-producing states of the Middle East and of China, of the connections between the two of them. But you've also talked and written about the problems of the oil-importing countries of the Middle East, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Morocco, Syria, Tunisia. And you've written of the clear lesson of the Arab Spring that even rapid economic growth cannot be maintained unless it is inclusive. To what degree does this new Silk Road include all the states and peoples along it?
Thank you very much. So let me make 3 points. And let me start with the first one, which is in answer to your question, which is, we talk about this new Silk Road, but the road isn't new. And actually, it's now reasonably well traveled. One of the things that surprised me when I started looking at this a couple of years ago is that there is already a rapidly growing trade along this Silk Road. So the fastest growing trade between the oil importing countries in the region and their partners has been either with the oil exporting countries within the region or with Asia. So it's, in fact, there is that trade beginning to happen. Morocco is already trading more and more with Africa, not just commercial products, but services, banking, other businesses. So there is already a beginning of a reaching out. But the trade route is still dominated by commodities going out from the oil exporting countries and finished products coming in. So that's a dynamic that in a way needs to change. There's a lot of people trading on this route as well. If you look at it, the number of, for example, people from China who are now sitting in the Middle East as part of the network that is helping to establish and develop markets is, again, a surprising number. If you look in Egypt, if you look in, used to look in Syria, there were a lot of people sitting there who were from East Asia. Second point I want to make is that if you look forward now 10 years, everyone right now is focused on the recession in Europe this year. And obviously that everyone is saying that for emerging markets, particularly for the oil importing countries that are going through a transition themselves, this makes the process of recovery harder because their trading partners in Europe, instead of growing, are actually contracting. But if you look at the next 5 years, the next 10 years, the pace of economic growth in the traditional markets in Europe is going to be a fraction of the pace of growth in Asia. Here in Dubai, you said that one of the reasons why this city was recovering was maybe perhaps because of or despite the turmoil in the region. Actually, one other reason why this city has been recovering is trade and logistics with Asia. That's what's driving a lot of the growth in Dubai. So what's happening in Dubai is simply a forerunner of where you're going to see the growth links coming out for the next 5 or 10 years. So I think it's almost inevitable that the links with Asia, with emerging markets more generally, are going to be the key drivers of growth. And then the question becomes, that's my third point, are countries in the region positioned to take advantage of the opportunities that are going to be around over the next decade? And there I see a short-term and a long-term set of challenges. The short-term challenges, focusing now again on the oil importing countries, Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, Tunisia, Lebanon. The short-term challenges that many of them have been hit by a combination of adverse external shocks, high oil prices, no growth in their markets, and spillover effects. Last year it was Libya. This year the big spillover that everyone is focused on is Syria. And on top of that, their own domestic historic political transformation and transition, which, while it has the potential to improve people's lives enormously and make them richer and more fulfilling in the future, in the short term is leading to uncertainty, wait and see by investors, consequently big collapse in economic activity. So Egypt and Tunisia last year actually contracted rather than expanding. Unemployment today, there are more young people unemployed today than there were before the revolution started. Now, in a long-term trend, you can see that this is simply part of a J-curve you're going through. But when you're sitting in the middle of a J-curve, you haven't got a job. It's very little comfort to be told that, in the long run, this is simply a price you pay for getting there. So short run, avoiding macroeconomic instability, which is a real risk now, responding to the social demands of people who are much more impatient than they were a year ago, and trying to bring investors back who are holding back and saying, we're not quite sure where all this is going, and I'm cautious, I'd rather wait, is a big challenge facing governments who are themselves, in many cases, transition governments, and consequently, with a few weeks or a few months horizon, very hard for them to formulate a long-term strategy. And that's the final point I want to make, which is that the big medium-term challenge for these countries to be able to take advantage of the opportunities that will be there is not macroeconomic instability, because they were never macroeconomically unstable in the past. What drove the revolutions wasn't that young people felt inflation was hyper. What drove the revolutions was the fact that apart from the political and voice issues, they didn't get jobs, they didn't feel they have access to growth, they didn't feel that they had an equal shot at being able to open a small business. So it's the modernization of economies and making them internally much more competitive, changing the educational system so that the young people coming out of the schools and colleges are trained for the jobs and have the entrepreneurial opportunities that will be there, rather than waiting for their number to come up so they can get a public sector job which promises them security and lifetime employment. And that transformation challenge, which is about restructuring the business environment on which most countries in this region fall behind compared to their competitors in other regions. Restructuring public finances so they move away from generalized public subsidies to targeted safety nets, and trying to create the infrastructure base that enables both IT and traditional hardware to take off is the big challenge that people have to come to grips with, and where I think there is still work to be done to create a consensus on what is the core agenda for each of those countries, without which it will be hard to take advantage in this new global environment where really, I would actually say, as you say, average may be officially dead, but it's not even clear to me that just being slightly above it, you're going to catch up, because the average is also moving all the time. So you may think you're just getting to the average, you just discover looking around that you're a lot better than you were a few years ago, but your competitors are a lot better still. So I think that's personally going to be the big transformational challenge that's going to be the focus for the next decade.
Good, thank you very much. I see the panelists are taking notes, and we have some questions already pending. Nader, let me take a slightly different tack. I wanted to thank you for writing an excellent article for us a year ago. It's the 125th anniversary of the IHT, so I'm going to throw in a little plug here and there like that. And maybe I'll even quote from it. It was about the Arab Spring, and you wrote that the task of remaking their countries into modern, productive, representative societies with equal rights for men and women will be hard enough for the next Arab generation of leaders. Another prolonged and bloody conflict with the West will provide the perfect excuse for Arab autocrats to change the subject. Is there anything you'd say today to update this thought?
I think, first of all, that changing the subject has been a challenge really for the politics of this region for a very long time. And coming back to some of Tom's comments, whether it's Israel-Palestine, whether it is in Egypt and the bogeyman of the Brotherhood, whether it's in this region and the question of Iranian involvement, changing the subject away from the more structural drivers of change has been, I think, a very important impediment to the kind of progress the region has seen. In the context of our conversation about the New Silk Road.
Nader, could you put your mic up? It's a little larger.
Okay. Better? Okay.
Yeah.
In the context of the discussion of a New Silk Road, I think there are a couple of things that are worth noting that are important. First of all, that it is a moment and a long-term structural trend of immense promise to this part of the world and to the rest of the corridor that runs from Latin America through Africa and the Middle East to Asia. It is, however, and as this emerging market, New Silk Road country trade increases, there are a couple of very important dimensions of this. One is the increasing disintermediation of Western capital markets, both in London and New York, and what that will mean both in terms of opportunity as well as responsibility for entities, companies, countries in this region. But I think one of the risks that we have to highlight as part of this long-term, I think very positive story of opportunity and growth is the human capital and human aspect of this around the social compact. I think the lesson certainly of the last year and a half in the region has been that where the social compact breaks down, even where at the top line there's economic growth and there seems to be prosperity, even reforms, if the social compact fundamentally isn't there between rulers and ruled in terms of not simply democracy in the sense that it's applied in the West, but a form of accountability and a form of legitimacy. Without those two dimensions, and I use them because if you go to China today, and we'll come back to the threat in China today, but I think in China, obviously there is not conventional democracy in the Western sense, but there has been a social compact that has succeeded, partly because the system has delivered for hundreds of millions of people, creating a context and a life opportunity for them that they otherwise wouldn't have had, but also because there is a form of accountability and even legitimacy of outcomes and legitimacy of results, and that is certainly what has been absent here. And so as we look out on this trend, ensuring that the social compact, and obviously the Arab awakening is about creating such a compact, will be very, very important. It will be important here, and it will be important on other stops on the Silk Road. The second part that is enormously important, particularly I think for this region to keep in mind, is that the New Silk Road will be immensely impacted by the energy revolution that's going on in the world today. We're seeing the disruptive power of technology transforming energy, whether it's new forms of energy, whether it's unconventional forms of energy, shale gas, other forms of hydrocarbons, which will transform the energy dependence of the United States and North America on this part of the world. But importantly, against, I think, many people's expectations that will simply be picked up by China, yes, possibly in the short term, but in the medium and long term, China itself will be exploring shale, and there we will see a very, very different energy picture, which will change the dependence of the world on this part of the region, and certainly also change some of the economic drivers. And then I would finally close again with, Tom mentioned the big story of the moment being technology, being globalization. I would say that there is a very important challenge that underlines this New Silk Road phenomenon, because coupled with this phenomenon, really, which both is a cause and an effect of decoupling. This is the decoupled world playing out along the trade routes that go along the Southern Silk Road, is going to be a more fragmented global politics. What you're seeing across the world in emerging markets, in growth markets, is countries increasingly adopting new forms of economic and political governance that don't have as a model either the United States or China or Europe, but are more responsive to local needs, more responsive to national aspirations, and is creating a much more complex mosaic of politics, which will be difficult to manage, much messier, but I think a different kind of equilibrium is going to be possible because those politics have the chance of being more legitimate because they come from within rather than being imposed from the outside, which has been the case for a lot of this world. So an enormous, I think, opportunity around this, but the management of this new Silk Road future is going to be immensely messy and complex too.
Well, thank you very much. Let me remind people who are watching this that you can send us comments and questions, hashtag IHT125. Tarik, I was reading your site, Silatech, and it had this statement that over the past 50 years, the region as a whole has experienced the world's highest rate of population growth. Today, 1/3 of the population is below the age of 15 and 2/3 under the age of 30. That precluded me from asking why an organization like this is necessary. And I'd like very much to hear from you about the challenge this poses. Also, as the founding dean of the Dubai School of Government, maybe you can give us a few words about the importance of President Obama's visit to Afghanistan and what happened there, if the spirit takes you in that direction.
Thank you, Serge. I've had the pleasure of listening to all my colleagues, distinguished speakers and thinkers, and I think each one of them has provoked a reaction in me, a reaction perhaps to question some of what has been said or to add to it. And I'm going to try to respond to the questions, but in the interest of keeping the fluid dynamics of this discussion, please allow me to perhaps weigh in a little bit on some of the issues that have been raised by the previous three speakers. I think it's very difficult for any of us to think about the new Silk Road, and I include myself in that group, sitting in this region in the post-Arab Spring moment where you've got some of the profound existential questions that Tom has asked and Masood have also raised. A year and a half into reacting to events that were happening across the region, events that many of us didn't think would happen in our own lifetime, let alone for them to happen in the manner that they did, creating possibilities for entire restructuring of societies with a view to championing the youth who are at the forefront of change and whose aspirations and dreams require policy focus and the resources necessary. Being absorbed in this and having to at the same time wonder what does the new Silk Road mean was not a very, very easy moment of realization, and it wasn't an easy, thoughtful process when I started reflecting on it. My initial gut reaction when I received the invitation, and the invitation asked the question, what does the new Silk Road mean? I started asking the question, what does it mean for the Arab Spring? I think your view of the Arab Spring and what it means for the Arab countries is going to shape your view of what the new Silk Road means. One of my early thoughts on the Arab Spring and what it means for the region at large was that in contrast to just a couple of years ago in this great city of Dubai, when we were debating the end of history, the convergence of Arab countries around a singular model of state-led, top-down management of development, economics, and politics, and where the labor exporting, oil importing countries, so even the Moroccos and the Syrias and the Libyas, everybody wanted to be like Dubai and everybody wanted to be like Asia. That convergence in ideas, and I would say in policies also, and in outlook, has been dealt possibly a fatal blow by events around the Arab Spring. So one of the things I have spoken about recently, a number of other venues, is that in fact you're going to see two Arab worlds at least emerge out of this. That convergence that happened just a couple of years ago is now going to give rise to a divergence where you have the so-called revolutionary countries on their own trajectory, and the non-revolutionary countries, call them evolutionary countries, call them the Gulf countries. These two are going to grow apart in more ways than we possibly realize. If that is the case, and if you happen to be a pan-Arabist or an Arab nationalist, and you raise your hand, you say, what happens to my dream of regional integration? I think the new Silk Road poses a threat to the extent that it reinforces this process by pulling in the Gulf countries even faster into Asia, not only through oil and through export markets, but I would argue through the appeal of state-led approaches to development, leaving thereby the rest of the Arab world languishing possibly in the transition to what would be the new compact. So that's one initial reaction to what the new Silk Road could possibly mean. But there's also another reaction that is relevant and plausible in my view, and that is, at this moment when the oil importing countries, the countries in dire circumstances, going through this very rough transition with Tunisia, Egypt, just to name two, with imminent fiscal difficulties, short-term threats that are not going to go away in a matter of months, possibly years, with immense dislocation, and where the Western world and its institutions, traditionally the backbone of support at a moment of crisis, are both reluctant, disengaged, or maybe even intellectually unable to cope with what is required in order to give these countries a chance of being on the right trajectory. Is it possible that China could step in at this moment? Could China step in opportunistically for its own, for the primary commodities, for other geopolitical interests it has in the region, fulfill and invest and provide the financing gaps that are now currently missing, and where you have politicians eagerly trying to establish any semblance of stability at a moment of immense threat? Could it be the case that these countries will also be pulled in, and the Arab Spring would also be about not only China and these countries coming together, but an exchange of trade, flows, and also ideas that will go hand in hand with? Let's also remember that even in the countries that have gone through change at the moment, ideas of state capitalism, of state provision of welfare, of subsidies, of the free availability of public goods are widely shared, widely accepted, and have immense appeal, not only to those who rule, but also the educated and the ruling classes, including the very parties that Tom had mentioned earlier that are likely to rule and set the tone for the future. So the new Silk Road to me represents, yes, the opportunities, but it possibly at this moment of uncertainty and trepidation and unpredictability and lacking an intellectual consensus on where this region is going to go and how it's going to get on this trajectory and stay there, represents equally, I think, a risk, at least for the perspective of someone who still thinks ideas of regional integration, of pan-Arabism still matter, still have a lot of cachet, and hopefully the Arab Spring will also be about reconfiguring them, refurbishing them, reintroducing them in a way that is in harmony with legitimacy and accountability and human rights and all the things we care about.
Thank you very much. I hope that all of you who picked up an IHT out there will notice a fairly strong piece by Ed Hussein of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's in Bahrain, a key stop along the new Silk Route, and he talks about his own interviews with the Crown Prince and about the strong feeling the Crown Prince had that the process has to be evolutionary and not revolutionary. But what struck me even more strongly was that Ed himself described Bahrain as being on the border of a regional civil war. It was quite a provocative thought. Ma'am, you had a question. If you would please wait for a microphone and we'll start. And if you could stand up, that would help.
Sure.
too,
Good
please.
evening.
Thanks a lot.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the question. Lara Satrakian of Bloomberg Television. I can't resist but ask each of the amazing panelists a question. To Masood Ahmed, you mentioned investors holding back in Egypt, but IMF's loan to Egypt, $3 billion, has been held up for the better part of a year. Where does that stand? And do the problems there give us some clue as to why investors aren't moving forward? And Nader, what do you expect of the Islamic Republic going to the talks on the 23rd? And looking at that net energy revenue, how much longer is it going to last to really sustain the patronage system and keep the whole system going? To Tarik, Yousef, could you run the midwife analysis on Libya, on unity and the state of play and what can move it forward? And Mr. Friedman, where does the U.S. stand in all of this? What could it do? What should it do, especially in Syria?
Wow. Get us rolling? In which order? No. Go ahead.
I'm happy to go. It's certainly a well-prepared set of questions. On Egypt, let me say the following, because I think Egypt actually demonstrates the difficulty that I was talking about of trying to formulate a consensus during transition. You know, the IMF's been involved now for pretty much since the beginning of the revolution in Egypt, trying to find ways in which we can help. And there have been a couple of false starts as the governments at the time thought they would come together with the macroeconomic stabilization program, and then for one reason or the other decided that this wasn't the moment for them and stepped back, or the governments got changed. And now we're at the point where we have taken a view, which is to say that Egypt needs now relatively urgently a national economic program which is going to provide confidence, protect the poor during the transition, and deal with the growing imbalances on their budget and on their reserves. To have this program, it's got to have a set of measures that make sense. It has to be implemented over the next year and a half, because you can't implement all the changes in a week or a few weeks. It's over the next year and a half. And it has to be adequately financed. So the IMF's ready to put money into it, but others also need to put money in, and others, I think, are interested in putting money in. But you're in a political transition where to be able to say to investors, to Egyptian depositors, to the people who are going to be putting money in, that this program is actually going to be implemented over the next year and a half, you need to have on board a broad political consensus of support, because it's not just the current transition government which is going to implement it, but the one that's going to come in a few weeks by the timetable that the Egyptians have set for themselves. So it's not an IMF timetable, it is the timetable and the process that the Egyptian people have chosen by which there's going to be a transition and a new government will come on board. So our view has been that there's been progress on the design of the program, and we've been in touch with the Egyptian current authority. We've encouraged all parties to come together to say, you need to take a look at the details of the program you're putting together and sign up to the broad measures. And as soon as we have that, and we try and build the support from the others who can finance it, we are ready to take that program and present it to our board for support. One of the things the IMF does do is that it can move very quickly when it needs to, and we're ready to do that. But for us to move forward, I think we need to have that reasonable assurance that this program is going to be implemented for more than a few weeks. And that's really been the reason why we're still not at that point. So I think that, and the reason I say this in some detail is partly because there may be interest in Egypt, but also because I think it illustrates this difficulty, which is how do you put together during a period of transition some program that is going to give confidence to the investors and the depositors in the banking system, and the small businesses that want to set up activity, that they're actually going to see this program being implemented through a year or through the next 18 months and give you comfort.
Thank you. There were other components to this question.
Sure. Let me speak to the Iran question. I think it's a measure of the success of the outside world's isolation of Iran since the revolution, and a measure of the regime's own stepping out of the global order, that we sit here and talk about the New Silk Road without talking about Iran. It's really an extraordinary thing from a historical perspective, from the perspective of the size and the weight of the country, its population, obviously its energy resources. Now, obviously what we're talking about now is not just the nature of the regime, but the nuclear question which is coming up in the next meetings. My understanding from the Istanbul meeting is that you have a government in Iran now that is clearly having its mind focused by the severity of the sanctions, the isolation of the country, and the threats of military action, which clearly have been part of what has brought us to this stage. Whether one agrees with them or not, there's no question that diplomacy backed by the threat of force has had a real impact here. Now, it is, I think, also the case that in the estimates of most intelligence agencies that the regime has not taken the decision to weaponize and cross the threshold. If that is the case, I think we are in a strange conundrum where much of the world, and I think including the United States and Britain, has a very, very limited appetite for another war in the region, and therefore would likely be willing to accept an agreement around the neighborhood of where Iran is now. You can talk about what they do with the uranium that's been enriched beyond 3 or 5%, but broadly speaking, be willing to live with an Iran that has the capability, scientifically, intellectually, what have you, but obviously hasn't crossed the threshold. The question is whether that will be enough for Israel, which has raised the capability threshold as one that they consider an existential threat. And I think where those two things meet is really where this is going to be resolved. The final point about Iran is that something interesting is happening in the politics of Iran in this period. And that is, if you think about the strength of this regime and its resilience since the revolution, it has been principally because they learned one key lesson of the Shah, which is that if all the power is concentrated in one figure, in one institution at the top, it leaves it very vulnerable. So learning that lesson, what you've seen since the revolution is that the regime has distributed power in a number of institutions, whether it's the IRGC, whether it's the clerics, whether it's the army, whether it's the office of the president, the supreme leader. What is happening, it seems to me, and this is an interesting phenomenon, is possibly that the regime is unlearning the lessons of the Shah and the lessons of Mubarak in Egypt, by the way, which is that there is an increased concentration of power under the supreme leader, which in the short term may make Iran a more credible and more easy to deal with negotiating partner, because you won't have a lot of the infighting going on and people trying to outflank each other. On the other hand, it is creating a system where the power of the regime will become more vulnerable to what is in Iran as powerful a movement among the youth for legitimacy and accountability of the government as anywhere else in this region. So that is an interesting phenomenon. It may make the negotiations easier in the short term, but I think will open up more dramatic change in the country in the long term.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Do you have some comments? Or?
If you want.
Well, let's see if there's another question out there. And, not yet.
Good evening. My name is Sean Evers from Gulf Intelligence. I'm curious if you could position this topic in the context of winners and losers in terms of the New Silk Road or the Arab Spring. And in that sense, if China is a winner coming into the Middle East, coming in to secure more and more energy resources, does that automatically mean somebody is a loser? Is America a loser? And in the context of the Arab Spring, is there similarly winners and losers in that? So if you could position the topic in the context of how you see that question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In fact, when I Googled New Silk Road, many of the articles I found had this idea of a zero-sum game, that Asia rising, West falling, and that the New Silk Road is an example of the triumph of this new world. Perhaps, Tarik, you'd like to.
I'll leave that to Tom on the bigger question of winners and losers, because he was asked also a question about the U.S., and maybe he can tie the two. But internally, the Arab Spring has to be about winners and losers. If these transitions, and again, maybe we're going to be talking in some detail about these transitions. These transitions are about shaking the rules of the game. And one of the biggest threats to Egypt or Libya or Tunisia getting on the right trajectory, where you're able to address, equity and opportunity, fight corruption, improve government effectiveness, enhance service delivery, and reset the rules of the game to ensure that you have an inclusive growth and an inclusive development process. One of the biggest threats comes from the old winners fighting you along the way. The old winners reinventing themselves, constantly finding a seat on the table where the rules get set, with the view to protecting their interests and ensuring that they maintain whatever capture of the state or society that they've had. I think how this plays out is going to matter a lot for the progress. It's going to matters in Egypt as it matters in Tunisia, and it matters in Libya. I think this is where the idea of the new compact, the new vision, that's hopefully going to be shaped by the new Mandelas who have new ideas, matters a lot. I think one of the big deficits these revolutions or post-revolution countries face at the moment are the lack of, not Mandelas in a very narrow sense, but people who can sell the public on the new vision. What is the 20 years going to be about? And anchor expectations and anchor focus away from the day-to-day distractions on that big dream. The second deficit in the post-revolution moment, it seems to me, is also a deficit of ideas. Ideas away from the traditional things that we usually fall on. So just to pick on one point, I'm a firm believer in the need for stabilization packages and financial aid to be well governed. But that is not a development strategy. At a moment where you have political constraints, a lot of uncertainty, and immense fears and heightened expectations of goods that will be delivered, I think this is a moment where we need ideas on what we can do given these constraints. And one of the frightening realizations from touring the region at the moment is we seem to fall back on what we know. We're not inventing or innovating in the space of constraints. So, for example, to be very concrete, you're not going to be able to amend the labor laws of most of these countries within 5 years to make them achieve the long-term goals of having empowered, productive youth. What can you do short of that? Can you innovate in that space? Can you come up with maybe short-term measures that might add up to something significant? The third deficit I would add, or the third problem, the third frightening realization is you don't have coalitions of actors who are mobilizing to serve any of these new ideas or to serve the public interest. Everyone is frightened. Business community is afraid of being involved and being labeled. Governments are very trepid. They want to stick their necks out there. Who are going to be the new actors and how they come together to serve specific programmatic or policy initiatives, I think is going to be one key shaping dynamic in how the post-revolution moment gets shaped, who wins and who loses, and where you end up 10, 15 years from now.
Would you mind if I just put a footnote into what Tarik was saying?
A brief one?
Yes, and I think it's the following point, which is that a lot of people like to compare what's happening in the region now to what happened in Eastern Europe with the fall of the former Soviet Union. And I think actually a lot of those comparisons are overdone, so I would start with that caveat. But one important point is the anchor point. What was the single most important long-term anchor for defining the nature of the economic and political transformation in those societies? It was membership of the potential of accession to the European Union. And alongside that goal, there was the vision of what they could become and an adherence to that vision. In many of the countries, Eastern Europe wanted to be like Western Europe, Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia wanted to be like Austria. So there was that kind of sense, but also there was a very detailed set of rules and regulations the acquis communautaire, that basically told you exactly what you needed to do in terms of your competition law, your banking law, your rules, regulations. And so over the years, different countries went fast or slow, deviated or came back, but there was always this kind of central direction guidebook and a endpoint in their mind. In this region, obviously, there is neither the clear vision of the end point that is commonly shared, nor a set of detailed guides and an incentive to follow them. So in a way, the external midwife role is much harder to play, and you therefore need to rely much more on the Mandela figure to be able to create that internal vision and sell it and build consensus around it. And that's where I do agree very much with Tarik that a year and a half later, what I'm beginning to get worried about is that the focus has been a lot on the political nature and the social dimensions of society, but there is still very little discussion of the nature of the economic model that will be followed in 5 years or 10 years around which we need to coalesce.
Thank you.
Well, let me just jump in on several things here, and also to take up the question that was addressed. To me, the question that comes out from everything that Tarik just said is, who will tell the people? Who will tell the people? There's a concept I just wrote a book about America, so I'm really focused on my own country's problems, but my own country's problems really relate to everyone else's. So we have a concept that they teach in the U.S. Air Force to fighter pilots. It's called the OODA loop, OODA. And it stands for Observe, Orient, Decide, Act. As a fighter pilot, if your ability to observe, orient, decide, and act in a dogfight is faster than the other fighter pilots, you will shoot them out of the sky. If their ability to observe, orient, decide, and act is faster than yours, they will shoot you out of the sky. Now, right now, I would argue that in my own country, our OODA loop is completely discombobulated. One of the most powerful quotes I got in writing this book was from a Singaporean economist who said to me, Tom, we in Singapore, we live in a thatched hut with no doors and no windows. We feel every change of temperature. We feel every change of breeze. You Americans think you're living in a brick house with central heating. You seem to feel nothing. Well, if we're living in a brick house with central heating, this part of the world has been living in a doubly insulated brick house with central heating. And now the roof is leaking, the walls are cracked, and the wind and the breeze and the temperature are all coming in and up from the floor. So who will tell the people? Who will tell the people what are the big trends in the world? And how do we orient our societies in terms of infrastructure, education, business laws to take advantage of these trends? And nobody's going to wait. No one's going to say, really feel sorry for you. I think the macro problem that this region has had is that it squandered what I would call its dictatorship dividend. If one could speak of a dictatorship dividend, Asia had a dictatorship dividend. We forget Korea, Taiwan, these were military regimes. These were military dictatorships. But they did two things. They built export-led economies based on the rule of law, and they educated all their people, men and women. And as a result, they created huge middle classes that were the midwife for a transition from dictatorship to democracy relatively peacefully. Unfortunately, in Egypt, Iraq, Syria, to some degree Saudi Arabia, you basically had a dictatorship that authoritarian governments, call them what you want, that used its dividend to enrich a very small slice of the population and then distract everybody else with shiny objects. Shiny object over here, Israel, Iran, imperialism, shiny object. And as a result, it squandered its dictatorship dividend. I also believe something else is going on in the world, which is that we are ending 50 fat years, all of us, and certainly in the West. And we're heading for we're heading for X number of lean years. I hope it won't be 50. But we're heading for some lean years. it's clear we built up a massive amount of debt. We in America, just speaking about my own baby boomer generation, we've made promises to the next generation we cannot keep. And so not only is this Arab Spring happening with no EU, it's happening with an EU that may break up. It's happening with America that can't afford a Marshall Plan for Alabama, let alone for the Alawites, okay? So it's a very different context. And so when you squander your dictatorship dividend right on the eve of the 50 lean years, or the 10 lean years, however many it will be, you're in a deep hole, and somebody needs to tell the people. And I don't know who that person is. And we come now to this challenge in the age of Twitter and Facebook and the internet, where it's so easy to spread rumors. It's so easy to delegitimize the business community. It's so businessman in Egypt is a 4-letter word now. Now it's true, I understand why, because capitalism came to Egypt in its most metastasized crony form. And so, but unfortunately, just when you need markets to lift you out of this, you don't have them. So just a couple words on Syria, because you asked. And I think one has to be just enormously humble about this problem. I think that one of my lifelong rules of journalism is sometimes the news is in the noise, and sometimes the news is in the silence. And as a reporter, you better learn to listen to both. So in Syria, you certainly have the noise of the opposition, the resistance. God bless it, I understand it, and I'm on its side. But you have a lot of silence. It's clear this regime has support. It hasn't sustained itself for a year by accident. And so we have to listen to that silence. What is that about? What's animating it? What's at its root? So my own feeling about Syria is that we have, it's very clear this began as a nonviolent protest in Dera by young men about corrupt government. And I believe the Assad regime deliberately turned its guns on what was a nonviolent, non-sectarian origin protest in an attempt to deliberately turn it into a sectarian one in order to rally that silence. And after a year, they did. There's just no question. So we now have a democratic revolt wrapped inside a sectarian conflict. It couldn't get any more complicated than that. So I think the thing we have to try to do is try to get the Annan plan to work, because what the Annan plan allows with 300 or 3,000, however many we can get, observers, it creates the potential. And this is a huge long shot. I have no illusions about this. It's a long shot. It creates the potential for the Syrian uprising to return to its nonviolent, non-sectarian roots, which is the ultimate threat to the Assad regime, if there are observers on the ground. We have to give that a chance. After that, I think we do have to think about things like a humanitarian corridor for simply humanitarian reasons, a no-fly zone. Because what are we trying to do? I think Syria is a country where there's a whole lot of people sitting on the fence. And every day they're calculating the situation. And I think what a no-fly zone might do might be enough to tip those in the army one way or another that are sitting on the fence. What is it we want and what is it we don't want? And I'll stop here. We want the regime to be decapitated, but not have state collapse. And if we have state collapse, it's why I'm against sending arms there. I believe you turn Syria into a civil war with state collapse, and you will reap the whirlwind. You will reap the whirlwind. And there will be no putting it back together. I can ruin any dinner party.
Hi, I think this is a point for the right question I have. Probably a little bit provocative, but we see East and West. We've seen that talk happening for a little while, and we see a political void. Is there a risk that because the West is in its own myriad jungle of problems, and the East is rising, obviously has its issues with energy, the Middle East, the Silk Road that we're talking about, is a victim of political void? and crumbles up into a proxy arena of political warfare?
Thank you.
Sure. I would say a couple of things to that. I think it is. I think it's a little bit a mindset of the world we're coming out of, to think that the absence of one unifying or one broadly accepted idea of political governance is necessarily achievable or necessarily a good thing going forward. There's no question that the kind of messy, fragmenting world that I talked about earlier will be more difficult to manage. But I think if you look at the structural drivers of investment that we on the Silk Road, which we started with, whether it is Chinese demand, the transformation of the Chinese economy, whether it's what's happening in Africa, the investments that are going into Africa, not just from China, but also from Latin America in very, very significant measure, and the new economies, the new middle-class economies you're seeing growing. I think you're seeing a different politics in each of those countries. Yes, a larger role for the state, but again, in places where the larger role for the state has actually delivered for a lot more people than conventional liberal capitalism of the Western kind. If you look at Brazil, if you look at Turkey, if you look at Indonesia, other stops on the Silk Road, I think you're seeing a politics that is differently negotiated within each of these countries. But you're also seeing them in a very fledgling way, and the G20 is messy and incomplete and all the rest of it, but in a fledgling way, understanding interests that are common to them, which may not be common to them and the West. And they're trying to sort that out, the Turks and the Brazilians and West Africa and East Africa. And I think you're seeing a politics which will quite possibly be more resilient long term, again, be more responsive to the national needs of these countries. And again, it's a little bit like the Arab Spring question, what have we lost in terms of stability? Well, that's not coming back. I mean, the pharaoh is not coming back in Egypt, and you're not going to have the relative dominance of the United States come back, whether the United States sorts its problems out or not. And my point would be that is a messier world. It's a world with a more diverse set of economic and political models, but quite possibly one which will find a different equilibrium that need not lead to a chaos of the kind of void you're talking about. Yes, the void will be filled with more voices, but more legitimate and authentic voices.
And maybe a bit more silence, hopefully. There was a question there. Yeah, sir.
Hi, my name is Amr Al-Husseini and I'm from Egypt. My question is for Tom, actually. There are people who believe that the Arab Spring is actually the start of the collapse of a system that was engineered during the Sykes-Picot agreement between Britain and France. And it might lead to a redrawing of the map of the Middle East and splitting the Middle East into two parts. One, which is the countries, Egypt, Tunisia, and Syria, who had revolutions, and the other countries who did not. So I want to know your ideas about that and if this is possible or not.
I think it's a very important question, and I think the order that when I began that I talked about is collapsing is a combination of really Sykes-Picot and so post-World War II, post-World War I order. And one wonders whether 10 years from now, the states in the region won't be called Tripoli, Benghazi, Tunisia, Egypt, Judea, Marunistan, Alawiyya, Sunniya. One can't imagine that real possibility. I think that would be a real tragedy because I think the Middle East is already losing too much pluralism in a world where the ability to mix ideas and culture and be enriched by that is one of the great assets of the United States. We have all these different cultures rubbing up against each other. And so I think to drive the region into even more homogeneous pockets would not only be a tragedy at just sort of the creative human level, but also the point about the EU I think is so important, that the EU was that magnet. But for states to try to act on the global stage now, from little pockets of one Liechtenstein after another, without a wider framework, I think economically it would be a real disaster. Because what we learned from Iraq is think about Kirkuk and the tension over Kirkuk, and then multiply that, because none of these states would break up neatly and cleanly, you know. So there would be not just the old border wars, but it would multiply the border wars 100 times. And so I really hope we don't go down that route. I think it would make the region truly, infinitely more complicated.
We have a question here in the center. I think there's a question here first. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the panel, for the enlightening conversation. I come from Egypt too. My name is Nermina Nadi. And my question is, we've ruled out the midwife alternative for Egypt. And I think we can comfortably say that we're ruling out the Mandela for Egypt, because even if there are many Mandelas in Egypt, they are not given the chance to organize themselves and to form an agenda. So the military is manipulating the whole thing and just putting a time cap at everything. So by definition, the whole thing is manipulated and is set to fail. So one is perplexed about the legitimacy and of the military towards its people, and how can the world let them do so? It's so obscene. Thank you. And I'd like
I would just, maybe I could, Serge, when he introduced me, referred to a column I wrote this morning, and what the column was about was, I was just in Beirut earlier in the week, was that, and so it will be remembered that in the year 2012, the United States made two financial commitments to this region that both began with the number 13. One was $13 million in scholarships for 117 Lebanese public school students, merit-based scholarships, to attend American-style universities in Lebanon, Lebanese Arab University and Hagazian University. And the other was $1.3 billion in military assistance to the Egyptian army in the form of planes and tanks. Having been to Beirut and interviewed some of the recipients of this scholarship, I can safely report that that $13 million, $13.5 million, bought America not only so much more friendship and support, but actually one of the requirements of the scholarship is you have to do public service in your community. Bought Lebanon so many more empowered young people ready to become good citizens. So we unfortunately have been caught ourselves in a trap. With the United States. Think about it. Sometimes you have to stop. This drives me stark raving mad, and I'm on a tear on this. We just gave $1.3 billion in planes and tanks to a country where 56% of the women cannot read and 25% of the men. It's just insane. It is true. To a country, we just gave $1.3 billion in planes and tanks to a country whose only predators today are illiteracy and poverty. And so what is that about? Actually, the story is like so much worse than you think. Because the reason we went ahead with that decision was because our own assembly line for F-16s and M1A1 tanks would have had to shut down if we didn't make these for Egypt, and therefore it would have cost our Pentagon more money. So that's why we went ahead with this. Someday archaeologists will dig this up and they will say, this was the moment of absolute stupidity, you know what I mean? So what happened was, I've always said that Camp David was to Egypt what oil is to Saudi Arabia, okay? It was this huge revenue source, and lurking behind it was always, we're gonna drop Camp David, you wouldn't want us to back away from Camp David, would you? And we bought into the whole thing. So, and by the way, the Israelis also reinforced that. So we ended up creating, the Egyptian army makes the People's Liberation Army look like pikers. when it comes to owning factories, hotels, businesses, okay? And we basically made a huge wealth transfer of nearly $50 billion investment from America to a country where half the women still can't read. Now, shame on us. This just got to stop. And by the way, and this is part of who will tell the people? Well, we also have to tell the people. So we have to, when the Egyptian generals say, we're going to, you wouldn't want to see anything happen to Camp David, would you? The answer is, you figure that out, pal. You want to tell Egyptians they have to go back into the army, back into the Sinai to fight the Israelis? You tell them that. We have been played for suckers. And in doing it, we reinforced an order that was not in the interests of Egyptians and not in our long-term interests. But we're trapped. See, if you're Secretary of State, everybody's afraid of the transition. No one wants to pay the transition cost. So Hillary Clinton, she just doesn't want Egypt to blow up on her watch. So she approves the arms sales. Even though everyone knows in the long run this is really negative, we have to disengage with this, we have to find a different way to connect up with the rising aspirations there. And because everyone knows I'll never be there to reap the rewards. The rewards for us changing our relationship to Egypt are 20 years down the road. And so we're trapped in this squirrel wheel. And that's why I've been writing what I'm writing, because it's really crazy. It's not helping anybody. And so, all I can say is I don't think this is going to continue. I think I'm hardly the only one who sees the absurdity of selling planes and tanks to a country whose only enemy is illiteracy. So hopefully it will change, but it's part of a whole mindset that has to change. And we've got to start looking at Egypt qua Egypt, not just in terms of through the lens of Camp David, which has become a really warped lens.
I just want to jump in quickly on the Mandela or midwife question. I think we have to understand that we're beyond both. There will be no midwife from the United States going forward in the way that it's played that role in the last 50 years. Again, the silence and the lack of presence of the United States on the Syria question is really very, very striking. And there won't be more Mandelas. We talk about Mandelas because there was one Mandela. What we need are institutions. And the success of South Africa is that Mandela put in place a process where institutions could survive the day when Mandela was not president. And that will be the case for all the countries of the Silk Road, which is to sustain this kind of growth, which is being driven by China, the rise of these commodity markets. It has to be grounded in institutions and the rule of law, where you don't look to the United States to be the midwife anymore, because it won't, and it probably shouldn't in a lot of cases, and there won't be a Mandela in a lot of these places.
Thank you. There was a question there.
My name is Tarik from argam.com. If the world is flat, can we say soon that the energy also will be flat? What do I mean by this is the emergence of the shale gas, especially in the US and in China. I would like to hear from you what's your insight regarding this subject. I think it's related to the topic of Thomas Friedman and Mr. Masood. I would like to hear your opinion about this. Thank you.
We clearly have a huge new bounty in terms of energy in the form of the shale gas. But extracting it requires a process of fracking that has enormous environmental implications. And, it is fortunate in a way that we've discovered this bounty or been able to unlock this bounty right at a time when this region is in more turmoil than ever. So we do have alternatives. But I think what we need right now in the United States, and that's why I think it's too early to answer your question, a very legitimate one, is we do need we need several grand bargains right now in the United States. 3 in particular. We need a grand bargain around debt and deficit. What balance between tax increases, spending cuts, and new investments? And that's what's eluded us so far. Secondly, we need a grand bargain over simply the role of government. Do we need a smaller, stronger government, or do we just need smaller government, or do we need bigger government? And that's eluded us. And the third I think grand bargain we need is between the environmental community and the oil and gas industry over basically the rules of the road of exploiting this great new bounty. Because, you know, again, in this kind of hyper-connected world, environmentalists, and I consider myself one of them, have a lot more power. We can shut you down. You know, I mean, I can have a picture on YouTube, as you'll find today, of me turning on my tap and fire, you know, being able to light the fire and the water coming out. And because of the way gas is infiltrated into an aquifer, few of those will shut you down. So I don't think the energy community has fully appreciated the kind of new world they're in and the need for this grand bargain. And because they have a certain allergy to kind of Democrats and Obama, and they don't want to do anything that will help him, they've resisted kind of coming to terms with this. So I think that's what will really determine whether this really gets fully exploited, as I hope it will be.
I'll make two quick points. One is that I think, as Tom said, you know, that there's clearly an energy revolution in the making, but it's not over the next 5 years that we're going to transform, or the next 10 years that we're going to transform the structure of energy supply. And there's lots of different frontiers to be traversed, technical, environmental, political, before you can get there. But I think that within the region, there's also some opportunities for better trade on energy. And I'll give you one very simple example. You know, Morocco, very much affected by high oil prices, and Algerian gas pipeline, you know, right next door. Well, there's an opportunity where I think you can see a natural complementarity, but it's really an issue which is not technical, but political. That has been one of the reasons why there hasn't so far been able to have that kind of relationship. And you can identify other examples like that. And then the other point I want to make quickly is that I also think that we've been talking about all the risks, but one constant in this is that I think that any government that comes into the countries where there's been the initial revolution is going to have on their minds the simple thought that they have to deliver. They have to deliver some results in terms of improved living standards within a 5-year horizon. Otherwise, it's no longer feasible for people to sort of simply keep postponing with other issues. And I think that, I mean, I talk not half as much as you all do to people in the region, but you keep getting back this constant refrain, this sense that the next 5 years is going to be a delivery agenda as much as it is a kind of agenda about the rest of the world or about trying to find the place of society in relation to other countries. And so I think that to me is actually quite hopeful, because it means that people will be pragmatic, no matter where they're coming from, because they know that if they don't show results, you know, the next election, in whatever form it takes place, is going to demonstrate what people really want.
You know, just to follow that up and to several of the questions here, because we have been sounding really grim, and I just came from Jordan, and I had really the most amazing time there. You know, Jordan's created a high-tech city, and it's so beautifully symbolic. It's where their army headquarters was planned to go, in the heart of Amman. And you see these beautiful buildings that only an army in one of these countries could have, you know, gotten the budget for. Only they now say Microsoft, HP, you know, Dell. And I met last week with a new, you know, a startup incubator there, and they brought all 40 of their Jordanian startups together. I got to interview these young people. They're amazing, okay? And, you know, my wife's a school teacher, my daughter's a school teacher, and one of the things that you see in modern education theory is very simple. A really bad teacher can leave, 3 years of a really bad teacher can leave a kid really disabled throughout their elementary education. 2 years of a great teacher can catch up for years of bad education. And we've had a lot of bad teachers here, you know, but where you do get really good governance, and in the case of Jordan, they put in, why did this spring up? It's because they have rule of law, really modern IP laws, really modern investment protection laws, great internet, My internet in Jordan is faster than my internet in Bethesda. And so one thing about, you know, this hyper-connected world, it leaves you behind faster. It also catches you up faster if you get the institutions that Nader talked about. It's all about that. Put the right rules and institutions in place. And it's not rocket science. They're all on the shelf. And you will see, I think, the youth of this region just explode. So I'm not in despair about that. But it's just, you know, getting the kind of leadership that will put that in place.
Thank you. I'd like to leave a little bit of time for roundup statements, so we can take one or two more questions. Maybe these two gentlemen here, and then we will ask the panelists to
Yes,
round
thank
it up.
you. Hi, my name is Tarik Antrazi. I'm also Tarik. I'm Lebanese. I read your article, Tom, from Beirut, and it was a bit, not a bit, actually, it was quite optimistic. Your comments about the graffiti on the walls and how people now dare say that we are against what, quote-unquote, resistance arms in Lebanon that are being used to oppress an overriding majority of the Lebanese. So there is a positive story in what's happening in Syria. And you know, we know firsthand the level of brutality of the Syrian regime, having lived through 30 years of their occupation. So this fear of what's going to happen in Syria after Assad. You know, Syria existed for thousands of years before Assad, and natural Syria, actually, it was bigger, not smaller. So why are we saying that after Assad, Syria is going to disintegrate, you know, and get into perpetual civil war? Yeah. And the second question is a bit related to that. Is it now time to say that the Bush strategy on the new order in the Middle East was somehow right, but probably poorly executed at the time? Thank you.
So before you answer that, maybe we'll take...
I got to go now, but thank you very much.
Gather these questions and for your wrap-up statements.
Okay, whatever you like.
Yeah.
I'm actually very curious about the role of Turkey in Middle East politics that really hasn't come up in this whole conversation. Over the past couple of years, Turkey has been very outspoken about Palestine, pro-Arab, and has been engaging in the debate. While it's pulled out from the EU debate, while it has its own internal issues and political reform and economic issues, it has been quite outspoken, quite supportive. Having ruled the Middle East for hundreds of years, it knows the region very, very well. Is there a vested interest? Is there a comeback? How much sincerity is there in the Turkish involvement? And is that a new power that is rising in the Middle East to substitute for some of the fallen ones?
And one more last one right behind. I'm sorry.
Hi, my name's Andrew Barden. Yep. I have a question for Tarik about the, you know, what's clear to me was the role of youth as a catalyst for the events that we've seen over the past year and a half. What's not clear to me is the role of youth going forward. I live in the region, and I see, I don't see many leaders among the youth here. And in fact, if you look more broadly, diabetes rates, obesity rates, dental hygiene, I mean, anything, it doesn't seem like the kids are being prepared to lead this region. And so I'd be very much interested in your view on that. Parenthetically, this is the fifth panel this year that I attend, and I have yet to see a woman on one of these panels, which I think is related to again, preparing the youth to lead. But I would like to hear your views on that.
I was waiting with great fear for that point. And that said, there was...
Thank you. My name is Giselle, and I'm a resident of Dubai. We're fortunate to be to be listening to this very stimulating discussion here in the Emirate of Dubai and in the very safe and stable United Arab Emirates. And I would be very interested to hear from the panel, what is your perspective on what this emirate and this country can offer, maybe as hope, inspiration, possibly even lessons? And as regards the New Silk Road, what is Dubai's role in this? Specifically, Dubai may be different to the region? Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we'll make sure to invite you on the next panel. I will now ask the panelists in reverse order to answer these questions and to sum up. We'll probably go over, and I hope that will not create any problems. So Tarik, perhaps you can start.
I guess a couple of quick reactions by way of summing. The first with regards to Turkey and Turkey's role, which requires us to also agree on what the Turkish model is about. And I think different people have different understandings of what the ingredients are in Turkey that make it a potential attractive model for different countries in the region. Is it the vibrant economy of Turkey? Is it the state-led, sorry? Okay. Is it Turkey's vibrant economy? Is it Turkey's equilibrium between Islam and politics? Newly found equilibrium. Is it Turkey's state-led model of economic prosperity, which involves very intimate coalitions between members of the business community and the ruling elite? I think all of these potentially matter, or are bits and pieces of it, and give that model quite a bit of appeal in the region, especially at this moment. There are, on the other hand, a lot of things about the Turkish model, attributes that may not be so attractive. Turkey, the nature of politics in Turkey tends to be very populist, and I think combination of populism and budget deficits and transitions can be quite volatile in the region at the moment. I think there have been some recent developments in the extent to which the state has exercised maybe a heavy hand in its handling of social issues, certainly media issues, and other related topics that worry me when people imagine a sort of an ideal model for Turkey and think they can just transplant that in the region. It's also the case on this that even within the Turkish elites, political and otherwise, not all of them think or believe that they have in fact a model that they'd like to export to the countries of the Arab Spring. So I think we need to sort of think about that question and better understand the premise inside of it. On the matter of youth and where do we go from here, I couldn't agree with you more. I think the business of being in a revolution is fundamentally from that of being a part of a state building, nation building, institution building project. I think the youth will play a role. I think a lot of what the policies ought to be about is empowering them and putting them on the trajectories and transitions to being prosperous, successful adults in a region that places still a huge premium on many important transitions that youth go through. But it strikes me that, and I go back to what I said earlier, what's going to be required at this moment of transition, and I would say not just required, I think there is an opportunity, and hence the despair I may have made visible earlier. There is an opportunity to work in groups, in coalitions, within the space of the new actors who have emerged. For every youth who may not be imagining or being proactive, there is a youth who's setting up a small project and is looking for finance, or is reaching out and needing a particular access point to the ICT revolution. This is where business leaders and banks and other social actors in this space have to respond and not necessarily wait for things to settle down, and for the state to give them the signals, sort of the old approach of doing things, where you're waiting for the signals from the top. All the signals now are coming from the bottom. It strikes me one of the roles that an organization such as the one I work for or others ought to be doing is facilitating and convening these actors who want to work for the public interest. In this particular case, working on youth empowerment, whether employment, training, education, you name it. I'll end with a final point on Libya, since I was asked earlier and I sort of dodged the question. On Libya and on all of these countries, Lara, I'm hopeful. I'm infinitely hopeful. And I would not want to go back in many of these countries to the status quo ex ante. I think there are many trajectories many of these transitioning countries can find themselves on that will yield the desired results. But I'm also very pragmatic and realistic about the short-term prospects, and hence some of the questions that have been discussed today. And I think the faster we come to terms as members of the educated elite in this region and outside, observers and writers, with the nature of this transition, the difficulties, the challenges, I think the better communicators we also become in this process. I think a lot of the time when you go to these countries, you find that these populations are much more at ease with some issues relative to how the outside world is seeing things. So the question about Libya that I get asked all the time nowadays when I travel outside of Libya is, are things going to blow up anytime soon? Within the body politic, the public in Libya at the moment, I think the questions people ask tend to be much more practical and mundane. They're about when will the infrastructure be built? When will the elections actually, how would I know that we're on the right trajectories? I think there is a bit of a gap here that needs to be sorted out.
Thank you. Glad to see that we're moving more and more towards positive news. So maybe you can
Sure.
tell us what's the good news along the new Silk Route?
Well, let me certainly start by echoing Tarik's point. I think there's no question that what has happened in the Arab awakening is the most hopeful development in this part of the world in the last 50 years, no question. What I think is also the case, to Tom's question earlier, or point, who will tell the people? Well, one of the things we're seeing is that they're telling each other and themselves. And that's not a bad thing, that they're not necessarily waiting for someone to tell them where to go and what to think. Now, that leaves a void, it leaves chaos, it leaves a certain degree of messiness, but that again is something that's been unleashed, a chance that the region now has that it certainly didn't before this. I will, though, just in my closing point, return to the point about institutions and governance, which is a lot less sexy and sounds a lot less easy than either a benevolent midwife or a Mandela. But the importance of institutions, if this Silk Road promise is to be realized not only here but around the southern belt of the planet, it will have to do with legitimacy and accountability of institutions. And what you're seeing in China now, and let's remember, without China, this Silk Road ends very abruptly. What you're seeing in China now is actually a very, very important tipping point, which is about governance at the end of the day. What this episode around Bojilai and the fall of this very, very powerful man says to a certain extent is that China is reaching a point where if you look back the last 30 years, you actually had a very remarkable process of 500 or 1,000 people at the top of the system who broadly thought of their own interest and their own financial interest to be superseded by the interest of the state and the broad country, very unlike Russia, say. The danger you see in China now and the corruption around Bojilai and what's happening more broadly is that China may be turning into a country more like an oligarchy, where you have this system at the top led by people who will build the 8th or 9th commercial airport around Shanghai, not because there is a demand today or in 5 or in 10 years, but because they will stand to personally benefit. And so again, the Chinese part of this story, which is absolutely critical, is also whether they manage this transition into sustainable governance with the right kinds of institutions that keeps rule of law and accountability and keeps the power out of the hands of the few. And in a way, the globalization enthusiasm that we lived through for 20 years and is hitting the bumps around whether it's the 1%, 99% issue in America or the broad sense of a disconnect and a widening income inequality, the threat to the new Silk Road promise is around exactly this, that the institutions will not get created alongside this fantastic growth in trade, and therefore the benefits will go to the few and therefore not be sustainable.
Thank you. Masood.
So I think that the big drivers of change, demographics, connectivity, need for better jobs, need for more representation in people in the region, to my mind, make me quite confident about the direction of change. So I think in the end, those drivers are what are going to be the dominant themes in terms of where one ends up. But I think it's very hard today to say what will be the path that different countries will follow to get to those ends, and how rocky it's going to be, how much slippage there's going to be. It's very hard to sit now and make firm predictions about the paths. I think what one can do with this circumstance is basically to try and prevent worst outcomes. So in our field, we're plumbers, so if you get plumbers, they focus on the plumbing. And so we tend to focus on avoiding macroeconomic instability, because if in the middle of everything else you have a financial crisis, it's going to make it harder to move the agenda forward. So avoid that. But avoiding the worst outcomes helps you to stay in the broad path, but within that, how fast countries move forward, how many hiccups they have along the way is going to be something that will vary across and will be determined as much ex post as we'll know ex ante.
Thank you very much. Tom, do you want to save your last word for dinner, or do you
It's up to you.
Go ahead.
On the question of Lebanon is a very important question, and what the real point I'm trying to make is that I think I don't think Syria is going to collapse, but if the institutions that have held Syria together over the last, certainly since the late 1960s, if those collapse, Syria will be there, and Syrians will be there. But if those institutions collapse, I think, we really could have a deeply unstable situation that will spill right into Lebanon, and that concerns me greatly. So it was really in that context that I was speaking. But I couldn't resist, maybe, just highlighting some of what was being given voice to in Beirut after so many years of a deeply kind of fraudulent, we are the resistance, when it was really just a cover for a naked power play. So every once in a while I act out, and maybe that was it, So on the question over here, I think it's a very important question, because I think if you look at the monarchies today, they have so if we look at three in particular, may have the best chance to play that midwifing Mandela role. And it's three monarchies in particular that have what they have in common is they've all moved to the next generation of leadership in a reasonably stable way. And here I'm talking about Morocco, Jordan, and the United Arab Emirates. And two that haven't made that switch, Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, are clearly having enormous problems. And I think we talked about, and I think it's a very important point, the role of models, because one thing the Middle East has lacked has been indigenous models. It's one thing to point to Turkey or the EU, or Israel, whoever. What's really important is when you see indigenous models, people like you succeeding. And one good example is worth 1,000 theories, okay? And it really does resonate. So if I were to look at if I were to end this with a hopeful scenario, what would it be? Is that if you take, and the UAE, we have to be humble about this. This is a country of 1 million people. And it's like people who use Singapore as an example, and I was just guilty of it. What you can do in a very, very small country, enormously endowed with oil wealth, is very different than what you can do in a big, multifaceted state. I think we have to be honest about that. But nevertheless, what is it we're trying to do? I think that Serge can talk about this, but think of countries. If we could graph them. So think of a country like the Soviet Union. It was tilted like that, heading down. And what Gorbachev and Shevardnadze and the end of the Cold War and Thatcher and Reagan, what they all did collectively was they kind of gave the Soviet Union a positive slope. Now today that slope is called Putinism. And if you have to live under it, it's not a picnic. It's dictatorial in some ways, autocratic in other ways. hugely corrupt, So if you're living under it. But under this positive slope, in this delta, is the real agent of change. And it takes 9 months and 21 years. It's called a generation. Now you give me a Russia that's just tilted like this. Now, by the way, it's like being on an airplane that's flying through turbulence. If you're on the plane, it feels like this. But if you're on the ground, the plane looks like it's going like that. So where I sit, Russia has a positive slope to it. I have no illusions, again, about Putin. But what happens to that 9 months and 21 years, what's important is they can travel where they want, write what they want, start what they want, think what they want. That's a new generation coming of age. And if we date the Russian Democratic Revolution to 1990, isn't it interesting that the first mass-based protest against Putin began in 2011, almost exactly 9 months and 21 days from the start of that revolution? So give me a UAE that's pointed like this. I know it's not perfect. I don't live here. I'm not in the plane going through the turbulence. I just see the slope of the line. Give me a Jordan that's able to maintain that slope. Give me a Morocco that's able to maintain that slope. Give me an Egypt that's able to get from this to that, And so that 9 months and 21 years, that generation can grow up in a different Egypt, empowered in a different way. It may take 9 months and 21 years, and then another 9 months and 21 years. I'll give you a different Middle East.
Thank you. The 9 months sounds good, the 21 years words.